What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our Week 8 waiver wire additions for the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel. And feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, man, we got a lot to get into in today's video, so let's hop right into the content. All right, starting with the running back position, Breece Hall exited Week 7's matchup against Denver and suspected to have suffered an ACL tear. That will more than likely leave him out for the remainder of the season. So Michael Carter is rostered 66% of fantasy leagues. Might not be available in your league, but if he is a top priority addition. It's a tough couple of weeks coming up for the Jets at the running back position, right? They got the Patriots, the Buffalo Bills, a bye week, and then the Patriots again. But we all know how valuable the running back position is when it comes to RB1s and fantasy football. So Michael Carter should absolutely be added to your roster if he is available moving into Week 8. All right, the Baltimore Ravens backfield really was all over the place moving into Week 7. I mean, I really thought Kenyon Drake would have another good game. We all knew that the Cleveland Browns defense was really bad against the run, but Gus Edwards was officially activated Sunday morning, and he made himself very present quickly. 18.6 fantasy points, 16 touches, 66 yards on the ground, and 2 scores. Listen, this backfield for the Ravens is always relatively volatile. I would ride the hot hand, and right now that's Gus Edwards. He gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Week 8, who just looked absolutely silly against Donta Foreman and Chuba Hubbard, who we're about to talk about. So I think that Gus Edwards is the back to own for the Ravens. Could that change at any point? Yes, because that's what the Baltimore Ravens like to do to us in fantasy football. But regardless, at the moment, with the performance Edwards had in Week 7, he's absolutely worth the addition. All right, Donta Foreman and Chuba Hubbard. Let's take a look at the Panthers running backs. Listen, Chuba Hubbard had to exit the game with an ankle injury in the fourth quarter, but before doing so, he had 15.3 fantasy points, 63 yards on the ground, a score, and 2 receptions. Donta Foreman, on the other hand, 16.5 fantasy points, 118 rushing yards off of 15 touches and 2 receptions. They get the Atlanta Falcons in Week 8. Listen, I know in a lot of fantasy football leagues out there, both of these running backs got picked up, but if they are available in your respective leagues, they should be rostered. They are going to be flex options when healthy, it looks like, for the remainder of the season. It was a really nice performance out of both running backs in Week 7. All right, Isaiah P. listed as the starter for the Chiefs in Week 7. Finished the game with 43 rushing yards off of 8 touches. Jarrett McKinnon didn't do much with just 4 total touches on this game, but CEH still had a touchdown and 6 touches, 32 yards on the ground. He had the best fantasy performance at 9.2 points. So I still think we're seeing somewhat of a committee here for the Chiefs, regardless of who is listed as the starter. The Chiefs have a bye week in Week 8 before facing Tennessee, Jacksonville, the Chargers, and the Rams. So some good game scripts coming up. I still think we should keep a close eye on Isaiah P. And if you're desperate enough and you want to stash him, I do think he is worth doing so, but he sits at 60% rostered at the moment, according to the Sleeper app. So if he is available in your league, all I'm saying is he is definitely worth a stash, but definitely a relatively disappointing week in Week 7. All right, Latavius Murray really looks to be the running back for the Denver Broncos who is the most in tune with this offense. Melvin Gordon still out-touched him by 3 total touches, but 8 touches for Murray in Week 7, 24 yards on the ground, and a touchdown after having 66 rushing yards the week before against the Chargers. They get the Jacksonville Jaguars in Week 8. If you're desperate enough, you can go after Murray. He's sitting at 44% rostered. Not my favorite player in terms of the running back position, but if you miss out on some of the top guys like Carter, Edwards, Foreman, or Chuba Hubbard, I do think that Murray is worth the addition. All right, looking at Kyron Williams of the Rams. We talked about him last week, right? Listen, at some point he's going to be healthy. He's definitely just a stash at the moment, but we're getting closer and closer to the point where Kyron Williams should be healthy, and to the point where Cam Akers will no longer be on the Rams, presumably. So I do think that Williams is still worth a stash. As long as you can put him on IR, it's probably not going to hurt your fantasy roster. So continue to monitor Williams in your league as we approach Week 8. All right, moving on to the wide receiver position. Mecole Hardman had an absolutely crazy fantasy day. And listen, guys, for the first couple of weeks of the season, I was really off of the Chiefs wide receivers, just no consistency, not enough usage. But in the last couple of weeks, they have absolutely balled out and been consistent, right? MVS, probably the least consistent overall, but has at least 14 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 matchups. Juju Smith-Schuster has at least 22 points in his last 2 games, and McCole Hardman has 12 or more points in his last 3 games. So I'm starting to like these Kansas City Chiefs wide receivers, and they're being utilized much more heavily. They have a bye week in week 8, but especially with all the injuries we saw in week 7, I do think that Hardman is a player that we should consider as a top waiver priority moving into 8 weeks. 3 total touchdowns for Hardman. Definitely a player who I want to take a look at as the week approaches. All right, Paris Campbell still feels a little risky to me, but the reality is he has 18 or more fantasy points in his last 2 matchups, and he gets the Washington Commanders, who've been very bad against wide receivers. And 23 fantasy points in week 7, 70 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He's got really good chemistry with Matt Ryan, so I think Campbell is definitely worth an addition. It might not be a player that you're going to start right away, but the last 2 weeks have shown us enough consistency that I do like Campbell at the moment. All right, Marquise Goodwin of the Seattle Seahawks at 22.7 points in week 7 against the Chargers. He had 2 touchdowns as well. Listen, guys, I like this Seattle Seahawks offense. They're at the top of their division at this point in the season. They got a nice matchup in week 8 against the Giants, who are all, 2 underdog teams playing really good football here in 2022. So I like this matchup in week 8. On top of that, DK Metcalf got banged up. At the moment, his x-rays are actually coming out pretty positive, but there is a chance that Metcalf misses a week or 2. And I do think if Metcalf is out in week 8, that Goodwin is definitely worth, maybe a flex consideration. So Goodwin, definitely a player to keep an eye on as we head into week 8. All right, let's look at the Giants wide receivers. Randall Robinson, 12.7 points in week 6, 11 points in week 7. Darius Slayton, on the other hand, 13.9 in week 5, 2.8 in week 6, 14.8 in week 7. So Robinson, 50 receiving yards and 6 receptions in week 7. Darius Slayton, 3 receptions, 58 receiving yards, and a touchdown in week 7. We just talked about Goodwin facing the Giants. Well, the Giants will face the Seattle Seahawks in week 8, and I just like this game script. I like this matchup, and I like it even more for the Giants offensive players. So it looks like Robinson is coming into the fold as the wide receiver 1, but Slayton's definitely still, getting a lot of involvement. But really the reality is that Daniel Jones is playing pretty good football right now and gaining a lot of confidence. So I like both Robinson and Slayton. I'm leaning towards Robinson, rostering about 45% of fantasy leagues at the moment, especially in full PPR, but I think that both of these Giants receivers are worth a look as we approach week 7. All right, Donovan Peoples-Jones, a receiver we talked about in last week's video, after having 12.1 fantasy points in week 4 and 9 in week 5, 11.6 in week 6, and now 11.1 in week 7. He's definitely shown us enough consistency in full PPR scoring formats that we need to take a heavy look at DPJ, right? A solid flex option at the end of the day. Does he bring some boom or bust? Yes. But I still think with the last 4 weeks being consistent, DPJ is definitely a player you can take a look at, especially if you're desperate at the position overall. All right, I feel like Josh Reynolds has been on every waiver wire video we've done on the season. He had his worst fantasy performance of the year in week 7 against Dallas. I get it. And most of the Detroit Lions had their worst fantasy performances in week 7 overall. Gets the Miami Dolphins in week 8, but the bigger aspect here is that Amon-Ra St. Brown had to exit the game in week 7 with a concussion. So Reynolds could see an uptick in volume once again, especially depending on the health of the rest of this team, who's really been dealing with a lot of injuries. But I like this game script in week 8 against Miami, and we all know at the end of the day that Josh Reynolds and Jared Goff have good chemistry, so he's still a receiver worth considering moving into week 8. All right, moving on to the quarterback and tight ends position. Okay, listen, we got Patty Mahomes and Justin Herbert on bye week in week 8. We got Travis Kelce and Gerald Everett on bye week in week 8. So most of these players I'm going to consider streamers, maybe not players that you need to go out and get right away outside of maybe Greg Dulcich, but we'll take a look at a couple streaming options as we start to wrap up the video. All right, Matt Ryan, listen, not a lot of consistency here. 11.9 fantasy points in week 7 after having 27.1 points in week 6, but the reality is he's had at least 3 games on the season with 350 passing yards, and he gets the Washington Commanders, who, let's face it, play pretty good overall against the Packers, but are not a great defense at the end of the day. So there's still some upside for Matt Ryan. Still a player worth considering streaming as we move into week 8. All right, Danny Dimes, like I mentioned earlier, gaining some confidence out there, man. His best fantasy performance of the season in week 7 against Jacksonville, 28.7 fantasy points, 202 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 107 rushing yards from my guy Danny Dimes, and a touchdown on the ground. We got to give our kudos to my guy Danny Dimes. In week 8, he gets the Seattle Seahawks. I love this matchup, as I mentioned earlier in the video. I think that Daniel Jones is probably going to be my favorite streaming option at the quarterback position as we approach the week. I do think you can consider Jared Goff as well. Listen, his worst fantasy performance of the year against the Dallas Cowboys, but I think he has a chance to bounce back against the Miami Dolphins. If you're desperate enough, you can go with Goff. I like Matt Ryan more. I definitely like Danny Dimes more. There's still some other names out there on the quarterback market. You can consider Jameis Winston if he's fully healthy in week 8 against the Las Vegas Raiders. I think is someone else you can consider streaming. Marcus Mariota is always going to be someone you can consider streaming. He gets the Carolina Panthers, who looked a lot better in week 7 than we thought, but he's worth, a look as well. Trevor Lawrence as well, had an 18-point performance in week 7 against the Giants. He is a tough matchup against the Denver Broncos. So there's still some other names out there, but I do think that Ryan, Jones, and Goff are probably my favorite overalls. All right, let's move on to the tight end position. Evan Engram now has at least 9 fantasy points in his last 3 matchups. 10.7 points in week 7 against the Giants, 4 receptions, 67 receiving yards. Just showing some nice consistency. Not a great matchup against the Denver Broncos, but I still think that Engram continues to be like one of those tight ends that you can just pick up off the waiver wire and plug in automatically and at least, bank on getting you at least 8 points. So I think that he continues to be an option moving into week 8. Greg Dulcich had another good game, 12.4 points in week 6, 44 receiving yards and a touchdown in that game. And I was really worried with, Ripien starting at quarterback and Russell Wilson being out in week 7. I didn't like the matchup going up against the Jets, who I think are probably the most up-and-coming defense in the league. But he still had 11.1 fantasy points in full PPR, 6 receptions and 51 receiving yards. So I think that my guy, Greggy D, replacing Greg Dortch on the Cardinals, who, hey, we got to give Greg Dortch his props for scoring a touchdown in week 7. But the new Greggy D in town is worth adding overall at the tight end position. He gets the Jacksonville Jaguars in week 8. All right, Cade Otton, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a little bit more inconsistent. But like I said, if you own Travis Kelce, you probably don't have another tight end. You might be in a tough position this week, right? 10.3 points in week 5, 4.3 in week 6, 10.4 in week 7. And man, do the Tampa Bay Buccaneers need a win more than ever. They face the Baltimore Ravens in week 8 after losing to the Kenny Pickett-led Steelers in week 6 and the PJ Walker-led Carolina Panthers in week 7. They have got to come out and play competitive. So I think that Cade Otton is in a good game script in week 8 against the Baltimore Ravens. All right, we talked about Jawan Johnson last week as a streaming option going up against the Arizona Cardinals, one of the worst teams in the league, against the tight end position. And he did really well, 20.2 fantasy points, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 32 receiving yards, and 2 scores on Thursday Night Football. He gets the Las Vegas Raiders, who are allowing the 6th most fantasy points to the tight end position at the time I'm recording this. So I still like Johnson as a streaming option as we approach week 8. And the advantage here is he has shown good chemistry with both Andy Dalton and Jameis Winston. So I don't think it really matters who's playing the quarterback position. All right, Irv Smith, on the other hand, may have been dropped in your league because he was on bye in week 7, rostered in 37% of fantasy leagues, 8.2 fantasy points in week 5, 10.7 in week 6. We just talked about Jawan Johnson having a good game against the Arizona Cardinals. Irv Smith will play the Arizona Cardinals in week 8, so I think he's a really solid streaming option and maybe even a player you could provide some nice stability throughout the rest of the season as well. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.